How does a man preach about faith while drowning in his own sins? How does he vow before God to cherish his wife, only to turn around and butcher her in cold blood? What kind of monster hides behind a pulpit, condemning others while secretly craving what he tells them will lead to damnation? He was a pastor, a husband, a leader, but beneath it all, he was a liar. A fraud. A man trapped in a secret love affair so dangerous, he was willing to kill to keep it. A $3 million insurance policy. A hidden lover. And a wife who never saw her death coming. This wasn't just a crime. This was pure evil. To the world, he was righteous. To his congregation, he was a man of wisdom. To his wife, he was the foundation of their family, the man she trusted above all else. But she never knew the truth. The moment she said, "I do," she was living on borrowed time. Because her husband wasn't just keeping secrets, he was planning her execution. When police found her body, electrocuted and brutally dismembered, it seemed like a tragic accident. But the more they dug, the more they realized this was no accident at all. It was calculated. It was cruel. And it was all for money, to fund the life he truly wanted, with the man he was willing to kill for. Welcome to Everyday True Crime, where we uncover the most disturbing real-life cases of murder, deceit, and betrayal. If you're drawn to true crime stories that expose the darkest sides of human nature, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. This case is one you'll never forget. Gideon Price stood at the pulpit every Sunday, preaching about faith, devotion, and the sanctity of marriage. The congregation adored him. They hung on to his every word, believing he was a man of God, a leader they could trust. His church was one of the largest in Florida, with thousands of followers who saw him as a guiding light. They believed he had the perfect life. A thriving ministry, a beautiful wife, and a reputation untarnished by scandal. But Gideon Price was living a lie. Behind closed doors, the righteous preacher was drowning in his own sins. For years, he had been entangled in a secret affair with another man. Dante Rivers wasn't just some fleeting temptation, he was the only person Gideon truly loved. Their relationship was intoxicating, reckless, and forbidden. Gideon knew that if the truth ever came out, his world would crumble. His faith, his church, his family, everything he had built his life on, would be destroyed. So, he did what he had always done. He played the role. To his congregation, he was the devoted man of God. To his wife, Naomi Price, he was the perfect husband. But Gideon's lies were starting to catch up with him. Naomi was everything a pastor's wife was supposed to be. Graceful. Loyal. Supportive. She stood by his side through every sermon, every charity event, every public appearance. For years, she believed their marriage was solid, their love unshakable. But something had changed. Lately, Gideon was distant. He came home later and later, brushing off her concerns with the same tired excuses. Church business, late meetings, counseling sessions for troubled members of the congregation. Naomi wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But deep down, an unsettling feeling had begun to grow. It started with the phone calls. Private conversations in hushed tones. Messages he quickly deleted. Late-night disappearances with no explanation. Then there were the moments when he looked at her like she was a stranger. Like she was just another obligation, another performance he had to keep up. She tried to ignore it. Tried to convince herself it was just stress, that the weight of leading a church was taking its toll on him. But the doubt gnawed at her. And once the suspicion took root, there was no turning back. She began watching him more closely. Noticing the small things. The lingering smell of cologne that wasn't his. The text notifications flashing across his phone late at night. The way his hands trembled when he thought she wasn't looking. Naomi was no fool. She had spent years by Gideon's side, knowing the man better than anyone. And she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was hiding something. So she did what any woman in her position would do. She started asking questions. At first, Gideon brushed them off, his smile never faltering. But as the questions became more pointed, his patience began to slip. He could feel the walls closing in. He could see it in her eyes, the growing realization that she was no longer blind to his deception. And that's when Gideon knew. This wasn't just a marriage in trouble. This was a threat to everything. If Naomi found out the truth, she wouldn't keep it to herself. She would destroy him. She would ruin him. And he couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not ever. Gideon Price had spent his entire life preaching about morality. Now, he was about to commit the ultimate sin. He had tried to reason with himself, to find another way. But there wasn't one. Naomi was too smart, too suspicious. If she uncovered the truth, she would ruin him. The perfect life he had built, the church, the reputation, the love of Dante, everything would vanish. And Gideon Price was not a man who lost. He needed her gone. But not just gone, erased. It had to look like an accident. Something tragic. Something that wouldn't raise suspicion. And so, the plan was born. He started by taking out a $3 million life insurance policy in Naomi's name. A grieving husband would need financial support, after all. No one would question it. It was just another safeguard for their future, at least, that's what he told her. She signed the papers without hesitation. Because she still trusted him. Because she still believed the man she married wasn't capable of evil. But Gideon had already made his decision. Her days were numbered. For weeks, he planned every detail. He researched electrocution, learning exactly how much voltage it would take to kill someone instantly. He practiced his grief in the mirror, making sure his performance would be flawless when the time came. And then, one night, he was ready. The garage was the perfect setting. Quiet. Secluded. No witnesses. No one to hear her scream. He rigged an exposed wire near a puddle of water, ensuring that the moment Naomi stepped into the trap, her body would become the conduit. 240 volts, enough to kill her instantly. Enough to make it look like a freak accident. And then, he waited. That night, he called Naomi into the garage, his voice calm, his smile warm. She had no reason to suspect anything. No reason to fear the man she had loved for years. She stepped forward. Her foot hit the water. And then, agony. A surge of electricity ripped through her body. Her limbs convulsed violently, her screams cut short as her muscles locked in place. Her body seized, trembled, then collapsed. Silence. Gideon stared down at his wife's lifeless form, his pulse pounding in his ears. It was done. She was gone. But something in him still panicked. What if the coroner questioned the accident? What if there was a detail he had overlooked? What if they didn't believe him? He couldn't risk it. So he picked up the hacksaw. His hands were steady as he worked. Each cut was deliberate, precise. Blood pooled around him, soaking into the concrete floor. The smell of iron filled the air. But Gideon didn't flinch. He had preached about sacrifice his entire life. And tonight, he was making his own. When it was done, he cleaned himself up. Changed his clothes. Took a deep breath. Then, he picked up his phone and dialed 911. His voice was raw, shaking. There was panic. Devastation. Horror. My wife, she's dead. Please. Help me. The performance of his life had begun. The moment detectives stepped into the garage, they knew something was wrong. The scene was gruesome. Too gruesome for an accident. Naomi Price's body lay in pieces, her limbs crudely severed, the air thick with the scent of blood and burnt flesh. Gideon Price sat nearby, his hands trembling, his face streaked with tears. "She was electrocuted," he choked out. I found her like this." But the story didn't add up. Electrocution was instant, sure, but why was her body mutilated? Why would a woman like Naomi, cautious and intelligent, be handling exposed wires in the middle of the night? It wasn't just suspicious. It was absurd. Detective Xavier Monroe narrowed his eyes as he scanned the scene. Something felt off, too controlled, too staged. And Gideon, despite his theatrics, didn't look like a devastated husband. He looked like a man playing a role. The first red flag was the insurance policy. Routine background checks revealed that Gideon had taken out a $3 million life insurance policy on Naomi just months before her death. That alone wasn't proof of murder. But it was a motive. And motives had a way of leading to the truth. Then came the second red flag, Gideon's phone records. Buried within thousands of messages, detectives found something intriguing. An unknown number. Hundreds of calls. Hundreds of texts. Late at night. Early in the morning. Intimate messages filled with longing, desperation, and something more. Something damning. The number belonged to a man named Dante Rivers. The more they searched, the clearer it became, this wasn't just a friend. This was something deeper. Something secret. And secrets had a way of unraveling. Detectives obtained a warrant for Gideon's electronic devices. If there was any proof of his guilt, it would be buried somewhere in his digital footprint. When they unlocked his laptop, they found a search history that made their blood run cold. How to make electrocution look like an accident. How much voltage does it take to kill someone instantly? Fastest way to dismember a body. And then, the final nail in Gideon's coffin. A series of unsent emails to Dante. Detailed messages outlining his frustrations. His hatred. His desperation to be free of Naomi. And his plan to kill her. The case had just blown wide open. The moment detectives dug into Gideon Price's phone records, the truth began to unravel. Buried beneath layers of deception were messages that exposed a double life. Gideon had been harboring a secret so damning that it shattered the perfect image he had spent years crafting. There, in black and white, was his deepest betrayal. The texts between Gideon and Dante Rivers weren't just casual conversations. They were filled with passion, longing, and an undeniable desperation to be together. Gideon's faith had condemned his desires, but in these messages, he embraced them. He spoke of Dante as his true love, the only person who truly understood him. He painted Naomi as the obstacle standing in their way. A burden. A mistake. And soon, a victim. But it wasn't just the affair that sent chills down the investigators' spines. It was what they found next. Among the declarations of love were messages far more sinister. Detailed discussions about Naomi. About her death. And how they would finally be free. "Once she's gone, it'll just be us," Gideon had texted Dante just weeks before Naomi's murder. His words were haunting. A confession hiding in plain sight. A promise of a new beginning built on blood. Detectives knew they had something explosive, but they needed confirmation. They needed someone to break. And Dante Rivers was their best chance. They found him at his apartment, a modest place tucked away on the outskirts of town. When they knocked on the door, he hesitated before letting them in. His face was tense. His eyes darted nervously, already suspecting why they were there. They sat across from him in the dimly lit living room, laying out their cards one by one. The phone records. The messages. The plans. Dante's hands trembled as he stared at the evidence. He didn't speak at first. Just exhaled shakily, as if the weight of it all had finally become unbearable. "You don't understand," he finally muttered. Detective Xavier Monroe leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Then help us understand. Dante swallowed hard. His eyes glistened with something between fear and regret. Then, slowly, the dam broke. And the truth came pouring out. He and Gideon had been lovers for years, meeting in secret, hiding in the shadows. Gideon had promised him everything, a new life, a future where they wouldn't have to hide anymore. But Naomi stood in the way. And Gideon had a plan to fix that. He told me he'd handle it, Dante admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. That once she was out of the picture, we could finally be together. The detectives exchanged glances. This was it. A confession. Dante had just sealed Gideon's fate. But there was more. Dante revealed that Gideon had meticulously planned Naomi's death, rehearsing every detail in his mind. He had even joked about how easy it would be. How no one would ever suspect a grieving husband. And for a while, Dante had believed him. Believed in their future. Believed that Naomi's death would be their salvation. But now, as he sat there under the unforgiving glare of the detectives, he realized the horrifying truth. He had been just as much a pawn in Gideon's game as Naomi had been. With his confession in hand, the detectives wasted no time. They gathered their evidence. They built their case. And then, they made their move. The next morning, they arrived at Gideon's church. He stood at the pulpit, preaching about righteousness and redemption. He didn't see them at first. Didn't notice the officers moving through the crowd. Then, as he turned to glance at the congregation, his eyes locked onto Detective Monroe. And he knew. The color drained from his face. His fingers clenched the podium as if he could somehow stop what was coming. But it was too late. The moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the illusion shattered. The perfect pastor. The devoted husband. The righteous man. Gone. In his place stood a murderer. A fraud. A man who had thrown everything away for greed and forbidden love. As they led him out of the church, whispers rippled through the crowd. Gasps of disbelief. Tears from those who had once trusted him. Gideon kept his head high, refusing to look back. But no sermon could save him now. The man who had preached salvation was about to face his own judgment. The trial of Gideon Price was more than just a courtroom proceeding, it was a spectacle. A nationwide scandal. A fall from grace so catastrophic that it left an entire community reeling. The moment the case went public, the media swarmed like vultures. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust into the faces of anyone willing to speak. Former church members, neighbors, even distant acquaintances, everyone had an opinion. And no one could believe it. The man they had trusted. The man they had prayed with. The man they had called their spiritual leader. A murderer. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Every seat was filled. Journalists, spectators, and grieving family members sat in tense silence, waiting for the inevitable. The prosecution didn't waste time. They laid out the evidence with brutal precision. Financial records showed Gideon had taken out the massive insurance policy just months before Naomi's death. Phone records painted a damning picture of his affair with Dante Rivers. And the messages. The messages told the entire story. The planning. The anticipation. The moment Gideon reassured Dante that once Naomi was dead, nothing would stand in their way. But the most damning blow came when Dante himself took the stand. He had already sealed Gideon's fate with his confession, but now, face to face, he delivered the final betrayal. His voice trembled as he recounted their secret relationship. How Gideon had promised him a future. How that promise had been paid for in blood. He told me he loved me, Dante admitted, eyes glassy with unshed tears. And I believed him. I believed every word. The courtroom was silent. Not a cough, not a whisper. Only the sound of Naomi's family weeping in the front row. Then came Gideon's chance to speak. He stood, calm and composed, dressed in a dark suit that hung a little looser than before. Weeks in jail had stripped him of his former radiance. His once confident posture was slightly hunched, but his eyes still burned with defiance. "I am being persecuted," he declared, voice thick with self-righteousness. "This isn't about murder. This is about who I love. This is about judgment." Gasps rippled through the room. The audacity. The sheer arrogance. Naomi's parents clutched each other, their grief twisting into rage. This wasn't about his love life. This was about the woman he electrocuted, dismembered, and left to rot for a check. The prosecutor didn't let him run with his delusions. She rose, her voice razor-sharp. "This is not persecution," she shot back. "This is justice." And the jury agreed. It took them less than 3 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. When the words rang through the courtroom, Gideon barely flinched. His expression didn't change. But his hands, once steady, clenched even after his conviction. Disturbing questions remained. How long had he planned this murder? Would he have killed again if he hadn't been caught? Did he really think he would get away with it? The case remains a chilling reminder that deception, greed, and betrayal can lead to unthinkable horrors. Even those who preach righteousness can be capable of the most monstrous sins. What do you think? Was this purely about money, or did Gideon always have darkness inside him? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more shocking true crime cases, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Everyday True Crime, and turn on notifications. We'll see you in the next one.